Welcome to the Tossing Salad podcast. I am Brian Simatros, your host once again, and we have a fun episode today. We are discussing the Beatles. Yes, that very, very old group, the Beatles. Specifically, we are going to be discussing, and breaking down a little bit the Peter Jackson documentary, Get Back, for the album of Let It Be, right?
It is.
Our guest today, very special guest, Amanda Wirig. And Amanda and I met each other on the new social media, the hot thing that's out there for social media, on Threads. And Amanda, before we kind of get into like the Beatles talk and talking about Get Back, I'm kind of curious, how are you liking Threads?
I'm actually really liking it a lot. I'm an artist and a musician, and I've been able to connect with so many other people who work in creative professions through that. And for the most part, people have been very supportive of each other and, promoting each other's work and cheering each other on. And it's been a lot less toxic than some of the other platforms
Sure.
I've been on. So
which platforms would you say that you're active on right now?
I'm active on Facebook mainly for my business. That's about all I use it for. On the platform formerly known as Twitter, because I still have some friends on there. Instagram and TikTok.
Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we'll get into some of the ways to contact you and kind of what you're doing on your side of things towards the end of the podcast, because I'm really excited to get into talking about the Beatles. Here's where I stand, and I'm curious where you're coming from being a Beatles fan and why you're here going through this journey with me. Up until the last couple years, I wouldn't consider myself a Beatles fan. Not because I didn't like their stuff. As an 80s, I consider myself an 80s baby. Mm-hmm. And growing up, I knew of the Beatles in a textbook kind of fashion, like, oh yeah, that was probably stuff my mom maybe listened to. They were always kind of like the group from back in the day. I knew a little bit about who they were, but nothing to the effect of like I was a Beatles fan or knew their songs or anything. Oddly enough, with Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary that came out, that is actually on Disney Plus, that people can go out and watch right now, that right there, I tuned in to watch because of Peter Jackson more than I did because of the Beatles. And I was like, you know what? This is going to be an interesting thing because I'm curious about the restoration, everything that went with these hours and hours of lost footage that they were able to recover. And Peter Jackson and his team put all this stuff together, restore it to the point to where it looks absolutely incredible, sounds incredible. And when I was done with this documentary, I was like, I need more Beatles. I was totally invested. Where are you coming in all of this?
So I grew up hearing the Beatles at home. My dad is an amateur musician. He's been playing in bands since the 60s. So we always had music at our house. And I remember as a kid, I wasn't like obsessed with the Beatles or anything, but there was a show on the radio on Sunday mornings that we would always hear after Sunday school when they would be driving us home, and it was this Beatles show. So I grew up knowing, the band and everything. When I was 16, so I'm just a little bit younger than you. The Beatles anthology came out 10 days after my 16th birthday. It's like one of the very few things where I know the date, And
what year was that? Do you mind if I ask what year that was?
It was 95.
95,
so,
okay.
Yeah. So like the very first installment aired on TV, and the hype around that was so huge because they had been broken up for 30 years, 35 years. I watched that and I was hooked. I was a guitar player, I'd been playing for only 3 years at this time. And like that band became my life. So I bought this little paperback book that had the guitar chords in it, and I was learning all these songs that I could learn. I wasn't that great at the time. I started collecting the memorabilia and reading all the books and like trying to learn everything I could about this band. And that never went away. I remember back in college, I actually bought the bootleg VHS version of the Let It Be film, which is what Peter Jackson took Get Back from. And,
Hmm.
having this like really crappy version, but you couldn't get it anywhere. And like, that's all there was. So,
And that was the project that they were working on that they abandoned, right?
yeah. So
Okay.
there's Let It Be the album, which they were making during Let It Be the film. Yes. Obviously, the original is much shorter. There's a lot less to it, and they were going to do a TV special out of it, and and you can see in Get Back where they're trying to figure out all these fantastic locations that they want to perform
Right.
in. And nothing ever came of that, and they ended up just going on the roof. They didn't even all really want to do that, but they made it work. So yeah, so that's what Let It Be was. But because there was so much contention around how the members were interacting with each other, and enough time had passed where they all had really bad memories about that time in their career,
Yeah.
that it was released in the theaters at the time, and then after that, like, you just couldn't get it, which is why I had to
Hmm.
get the bootleg from a record shop. There's all this negativity around it, and if you ever watch the Beatles anthology, you can see them talking about that in there. They're kind of like discussing fights that they had, and not really remembering everything completely clearly,
Yeah.
but they just kind of wanted to forget that whole period when they were working on that.
And I think Peter Jackson, and I've seen so many like behind the scenes of making Get Back, and when he was trying to pitch it to Paul and Ringo, had mentioned exactly what you just said, was that there was so much just kind of negative energy and memories that whether it was true or not, they weren't really sure. They were like, that there was such kind of a bad time. And Peter
Hmm.
Jackson came out and said, "Hey, I've gone through all the hours, and it's not kind of how you guys are thinking it's supposed to be. It's actually it's really good stuff. It's not as negative as what you guys are thinking." That's, I think, when Paul and Ringo said, "Yeah, let's go ahead and
Hmm.
do it."
Well, Paul's
So
come out in just different interviews, and he said that exact same thing. I just remember us fighting and hating each other, and then I went back and I saw all of the footage and realized that we were actually happy almost all of the time. I don't know.
there was a lot
It was
more than just the negative stuff that happened, and that's part of the great thing about Get Back, and with it being as long as it was, I think like 6 hours, the final project that came out, the drama part was because it wasn't just this happy-go-lucky behind the scenes of making something. There were some things that they had to deal with. I'm kind of
mhm.
curious, before we really start to dive into this project, you mentioned, I mean, you're an artist also, kind of your dad was into music too. What kind of music were you listening to? Like, I was born in 75. In the 80s, I lived out in Los Angeles, and that was when I was where I grew up, I was more into kind of a little bit of pop, but it was like West Coast rap. The Beatles were it wasn't gonna fly with what I was listening to or be interested in. What were you listening to at the time, that late 80s, 90s, where you were coming up?
I was born in '79, so I was a teenager at the height of the whole grunge thing and alternative and all that. And I was playing in a punk band in high school, and I grew up on like classic rock stuff. So I listened to a ton of that, but I was also listening to Nirvana and the Lemonheads and the Breeders and that kind of thing. And then I live in Minneapolis now, but I was living in southern Minnesota when I was growing up, and discovered the Replacements and Husker Du and the Suburbs and all these amazing Minnesota bands that were punk and post punk, and so I was really heavy into all of that stuff. But I've always been also like a huge melody person.
Hmm.
And the Beatles are like the epitome of that. I always loved like 60s pop and British Invasion and psychedelic stuff and all of that. It fit right in with what I loved. It just gave me a chance to dive deeper into the catalog.
The interesting thing with everything that you mentioned there, as far as the genre and the type of music you were listening to, that was the exact opposite of what I was listening to. everything that you said, I kind of wasn't into. But this crazy thing of vinyl collecting in the last few years has given me this opportunity to where I'm like, you know what? I want to open myself up and check out some of these bands or maybe a style of music that I know that I've had a lot of friends that were into, and
Mhm.
I kind of want to see what it's all about. And I love this discovery phase, and I'm throwing the Beatles into it because, again, up until 2021, when this documentary came out, I may have heard of a couple Beatles songs. The interesting thing is, the more that, like, I've totally headfirst into Beatles right now. I'm like, oh my God, there's scores of songs
Mhm.
that I actually know I never attributed to the Beatles, but were just redone or used for either movies, TV shows. And I'm like, that's the Beatles? And my
Oh yeah.
mind is blown. So that I this is going to be awesome, and I love the fact that I've connected with you because you may have to hold my hand through this discovery phase of other kind of rock, whether it's rock, grunge, along those styles. I may be picking your brain on some of the stuff. Like, recently I'm like, okay, I know a lot of people like Smashing Pumpkins. I never got into it, but I'm like, I'm going to get
Mhm.
this one particular album that I know a lot of people love, Melancholy and the Infinite
In
Sadness.
Infinite Sadness. Yep.
This box collection of it has been like super expensive. I'm like, well, I'm not spending that money on something that I'm not a big fan of. But it came down in price to like $70. I got it. And like, that's the thing right now that I am sitting down and just listening and learning. I wouldn't say it's something that like I crave to go listen to, but I'm
Mhm.
enjoying this experience. And that's kind of like this whole Beatles thing. I'm like, I feel like I'm a Beatle maniac, or I don't know what the fans are called, but is there something,
Right. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Oh well. Just full disclosure, it's gonna get even worse, and I mean that in the best way possible because you will never discover everything there is to know about this band. That's why I've never gotten sick of them. When I was a teenager, I borrowed my dad's Beatle albums on vinyl. At the time I was just like, okay, well, it's this album and this album, not realizing that there were American versions that were different from the British versions. So I grew up listening to the American versions first, and I,
okay.
made them on cassettes and everything. And then I discovered, oh, well, there's a British version of these that are different. And then you get into the whole mono versus stereo thing, and there are
Oh,
certain tracks where there are things that are completely different on the mono version versus the stereo version. So it's like, how deep into this do you want to go? It'll take you years, but it's
I
great because you don't get bored.
you're right. I mean, there's got to be in just what you were saying, and then there's the whole soap opera drama of when they break up, and then over the course of the next 10, 20 years, a few of them get back together, make amends, and then we lose John in 1980,
80. Mm-hmm.
and then we lose George in like 2001.
One. Yep.
So around that time, I have watched so many YouTube documentaries just because I'm like, I want to know more of like the behind the scenes and their relationship. Like, I am totally vested in this. In addition to loving the albums that I don't have all the albums either.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm just slowly trying to get to them. And like you were talking about the stereo versus mono, and then there's I just learned the other day there was this naked version of,
Let it be.
was it Let It Be?
Yeah.
To where,
So this was like, God, 20 years ago, something like that.
yeah.
Well, they stripped it back because so when they were working on the original Let It Be album, and then things kind of blew up with the band, the rest of the band brought in Phil Spector to work on this record, and he added strings and horns and all of this stuff. And Paul was furious that
Hmm.
Phil Spector took liberty with his songs, did things he did not want. So Let It Be Naked is basically him stripping all of that away to what he envisioned the record to be like originally.
The waters for the Beatles, like you said, this runs so deep, and I look forward to just being entertained through this whole thing. So let's, we can't cover everything within the hour that we have here, nor can we get super detailed, because I think we could spend hours on the Get Back documentary. And
Mm-hmm.
shoot, we may decide at the end of this, like, we need another follow-up episode to kind of get into some more of the details. This documentary, Get Back, Peter Jackson, again, this is the reason I watched it was because of Peter Jackson. I'm a photographer. I wanted to see what the behind the scenes of this restoration that he was talking about. And I saw a few documentary pieces that he's released, or either Disney or maybe the Beatles released on YouTube, to where they showed the original footage that they uncovered. Do you remember how many hours that they uncovered
Oh,
from this project?
I don't off the top of my head. It was just
Something
an
crazy like
insane
40
amount.
hours of video and like 60 hours of audio.
Mm-hmm.
And the clips that he was showing of what he had to deal with, I was like, this looks like this is nothing compared to what this final product of what he's put out. I was like, oh my God, the technology that he has at his fingertips with his company, his people restoring and basically pulling out the individual tracks of each member, the audio of them talking, each separating that from the main track, and then separating. There was this one that I was watching, to where they had a little bit of audio with John as he was talking over some guitar or something, and it was so hard to hear what he was saying, but they had the technology to basically pull that out, separate, and then lift the vocals or the whatever he was saying,
Mm-hmm.
and absolutely just blew my mind. This is what hooked me to wanting to watch this show prior to becoming a Beatles fan. I'm curious, like, did you watch this when it was first released?
Oh my gosh, I this was like my Christmas that year. I was so excited. Because it came out over Thanksgiving weekend 2 years ago. Like Disney only released each segment one at a time.
Hmm.
So I couldn't sleep. I was up at like 6 in the morning eating breakfast, watching the brand new, installment of this documentary. And I did that for 3 days in a row. And then I went back and I watched the whole thing like two more times that weekend.
Ooh,
It was, when you're like a super hardcore fan about a band that is so almost cliche at
yeah.
this point. It was one of the few times where other people were just as excited as I was. And suddenly I
Mhm.
had all these new Beatles fans to talk about this stuff with. And it was like there was this whole sense of community online. Like everybody was talking about this movie. Yeah, like, it was the best thing ever. I loved it.
What are your thoughts on us new fans coming about because of this documentary? Like, there's a little bit of gatekeeping, I think, to original fans or ones that have been Beatles fans for a long time, and then you have guys like me that came in literally in the last couple years, or in the latest craze of vinyl. Like, everybody's like, oh, I've got to have all the Beatles albums if I'm going to be a vinyl collector, and then like the Pink Floyd album you have to have, and Fleetwood Mac, and
Mhm.
everybody's like, oh, you're so typical or whatever. But how do you feel about like new fans like myself kind of coming in?
I will never be one of those people that feels like I need to gatekeep this band, because the more people that love them as much as I do, the better off it is.
Yeah.
And th- you know, they have made me so happy, and to see them doing that for other people like makes me happy as well. I don't think I am not one of those, like, okay, High Fidelity is my absolute favorite movie, but those guys are such music snobs, and I never ever want to be that way towards somebody else. I've had people do that to me with things like The Replacements and Big Star, and stuff like that. And you find the band when you're meant to find it, and whenever you do, it's great, and I'm happy that you do. And there are enough Beatle things in the world to go around for everybody.
I'm glad you kind of mentioned you find these bands when you do or when you're ready for them. And I think you just summed that up what I've been feeling with coming across the Beatles now, because I think if I would have tried to listen to the same songs growing up in LA mid 80s, when I'm listening to NWA and the DOC and all this East Coast West Coast stuff was getting started. I mean, I was a rap guy, and I kind I like my pop stuff. I don't think I would fully appreciate what the Beatles individually, what they were doing, or as a group, or the
Mm-hmm.
songs. I would probably roll my eyes. I'd be like, "Oh my god, this is so." Yeah, I don't think I was ready for it. I'm ready for it now. Like, I listen and I appreciate, watching Get Back, and as they're sitting there and they had what, 2 weeks to create this album and these
Three.
songs.
Yeah.
3 weeks.
Yeah.
So they're sitting there and watching these artists, and all four of them blow my mind of how creative and talented they are. And they're just kind of sitting, and you being a musician, you probably, have gone through this to where you're just kind of, I don't, is that just jamming out or something? And the creation
Mhm.
process just kind of, you don't know when it happens, but it just kind of does. If you're with some other people, and then magic just happens. I wasn't ready for this in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. And I've been through several genres of music to where, whether it was rap, pop, I went through like 90s R&B, which I still love, and then a little bit of country. And then now, 2023, I'm like, oh my God, I'm listening to the Beatles, Smashing Pumpkins. I'm starting to follow George Harrison's career after the Beatles, and now the Traveling Wilburys. And I'm like,
Oh.
what the
Mhm.
hell is going on with me? And I love it. And I love it. But the fact that you mentioned there's a time to where you're ready to
Mhm.
listen. This is what's happening to me. So, thinking about this project, the Get Back documentary, off the top of your head, when you're thinking about the documentary and the 6 hours of the final footage that he put together, what are some things that kind of stand out for you that you're like, "Oh," that just when you think about this pops up in your head?
There's a few things. The big one, and I've noticed like a lot of people have mentioned this, is when Paul is working on writing the song Get Back, and he's just riffing in the studio, and he doesn't quite have the words yet, but he's like, you can see him in the process of writing it. And to us, that song has always existed, you know?
Right.
We're seeing it come out of nothing and suddenly exist. And that's magical to me. And then also seeing some of the songs that they were working on that ended up coming out later, or they ended up being
Okay.
songs that they gave to other people. So I'm a massive, massive Paul McCartney fan. He is like
Okay.
my guy. And he was in the studio working on stuff in Get Back that ended up being on the Ram album, which is my favorite all-time McCartney record. It's the one
What was the
after,
album?
it's called Ram. Um,
Ram. Okay.
it's yeah, it came out after McCartney, which was his first solo record, and it's the only one credited to both him and Linda. But some of the stuff he's working on in the studio with the Beatles, it ended up being on that record. You also hear him singing a song that he gave to Peter and Gordon, because I don't know how familiar you are with like his output with John, but they ended up giving away a whole bunch of songs to other British artists, and like their throwaways were still number one hits for those bands. So to hear him like playing at the piano and singing some of those, that was cool for me to see that.
The way you describe that, and the fact that as an artist yourself, a musician kind of yourself. Gave me chills as you're describing it, because I'm hearing from somebody that really I can tell you appreciate watching a fellow artist, and one that is at such a level, create from scratch.
Hmm.
And that's, again, that was something that I didn't know much about these guys, but I could appreciate watching. Like, this is where I could see this next level talent and gift that these guys had, and not just individually, but the fact that you were able to really, all four of them were really gifted in different ways, and they came together. And as much as they had some personality conflicts and stuff, as we got towards the end of the Beatles, which I think is
Hmm.
going to happen.
Yeah.
Watching the four of them when they're sitting there, and the this is cliche, but the magic kind of just starts to happen. And I'm
Yeah.
there and I'm watching it, and I've watched this twice through. The first time I was watching, but I was kind of on my phone and playing on my phone as I was watching. And these episodes are long. And again, it's a 6 hour, I think, program,
Hmm.
documentary. The second time I watched without my phone in my hand, and I was picking up on details and all this stuff. But watching them when things were just kind of going, I was like, this is
Oh,
more than just being this boy band that was taking the world by storm. This is
yeah.
something I think just a music fan or just somebody that is creative needs to watch the documentary, watching these guys work together.
Well, and you have to keep in mind too that none of these guys were over the age of 30 when they did this. They're at the end of their career. Every one of them has musical genius capabilities in his own right. And the fact that the planets had to align in order for these four guys to even find each other in the first place, to be in the
Yeah.
same city, to have what they needed for each part to come together, and then to work with George Martin and to be found by Brian Epstein, their manager, and all of this. The fact that all of that even happened is such a miracle, and I don't think anything like this is ever going to happen again. Not in my lifetime.
Is there a band like them that comes close to what they have, like, for people that are maybe a little bit younger
Hmm.
for us, that haven't necessarily, like, they've heard of the Beatles, again, like me, they heard of the
Hmm.
Beatles in the history books, or our parents or grandparents maybe have said something about them. Has there been a band or an artist? Like, do you think that the Beatles, at their height and prime and their influence on the global stage, are they kind of up there with a Taylor Swift that's out there today? Or like, God, is there a boy band like, I don't know, the NSYNC or Backstreet Boy? You know what I'm saying? NSYNC,
Yeah.
Backstreet Boys, or no, not even close?
Well, I don't consider them even in the same realm because those bands were manufactured. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're like a Disney Channel thing where some
Sure.
guy picked like three or four guys that he thought looked good and taught them how to dance, and they made a band, right? It wasn't organic like the Beatles were. I think the only thing that really could even come close is Taylor Swift. And I personally don't listen to her music, but I can appreciate the fact that she has evolved throughout her
Mm-hmm.
career, and she's constantly pushing herself into new territory and trying new things and re-recording her own albums, and um, not letting herself stagnate creatively. But yeah, other than that, I can't really think of another artist that I mean, when you think about the span of the 7 years that the Beatles studio albums came out, and the massive change from Please Please Me to Let It Be. Granted, the culture was changing too, but you don't hear any artist nowadays making that kind of a leap like you hear on those.
Yeah, that's something that just today I thought about asking you, if there was, anybody that has come close. Like, would Michael Jackson or Prince at a level
Prince,
to where,
yeah, Yeah, I
A
mean,
Minnesota guy, you know?
yeah, we do love that man here. Yeah, I mean, he was constantly reinventing himself and pushing himself. And the man could play, I don't know how many musical instruments and play them all proficiently. And he was incredible. It would have been interesting to see what he would have accomplished had he still been here, you know, where he
Mhm.
would have been going next. With his career being cut short, we're never going to know what would have come of that.
There's two things that pop up in my head, and I'm curious your take on these two things that came up in the documentary of Get Back. I find myself just kind of thinking about quite a bit. It's my what's the latest thing to where I said what men think about like Rome or something all the time.
Oh, yeah,
That's
the Roman Empire.
my Roman Empire or something. After watching these documentaries, there's two things within the documentary that just stick out for me that I keep replaying in my head. The first one's going to be kind of an oddball thing, especially we're talking about the restoration and everything that Peter Jackson and his team had to do. But the one thing that stood out for me that I was glued to the TV as it was happening, and there was no video of it, was I believe after George had left the band and John and Paul had gone to lunch and there were no cameras, but there were microphones on the table or somewhere around the
Mm-hmm.
table that picked up on this conversation between Paul and John, who I correct me if I'm wrong, from a band perspective, those were the two leaders of the Beatles, correct?
Right. Yeah.
So that moment in the documentary to where Paul and John are going back and forth to where they didn't think they were being recorded. There's no cameras. And you're listening to the two of them talk very open and frank about the problem that I think John was trying to explain a little bit as to the issue between Paul and George and the
Mm-hmm.
fact that put your memory in this also. Paul was kind of taking a little bit too much control and telling George what to do, and John was like trying to be a brother
Mm-hmm.
and trying to he's part boss or part leader of this group, but he's also a brother to George and Paul. And they were having this discussion as to what the issue was. And Paul was basically saying, look, I don't want to really be like the leader or tell people what to do, but somebody has to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And listening to Paul and John talk about this, I'm getting chills thinking about it because you're seeing something very open, honest, and true because they had no idea they were being recorded. Do you remember that part of the documentary?
Yeah. And I had a little bit of an issue with that, with the fact that Michael Lindsay Hogg planted recording devices. I think it was in the flower arrangements on the table.
I think you're right. Yeah. And
Um,
explain, do you know who is that?
so he's the director of the original film.
Okay.
Um, it's also been rumored that he might be the son of Orson Welles. Um,
Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting.
it hasn't been officially confirmed or denied, but there are rumors
Sure.
about that. And I mean, he was pretty young at the time that he did this. He had done some other things, like he did the Stones Rock and Roll Circus, and you know, he was around in those circles. But yeah, that was his idea, and I kind of thought it was really unethical for him to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It look, you know, having that now, I'm glad we have that
Right.
recording. But and I think when you look back in the history of what had been leading up to that point, when Brian Epstein, their manager, died in '67, like they were just, you know, like '67 is when they did Sergeant Pepper, and like they were like changing the world. Things are getting really really big, and then Brian dies, and Brian was like their anchor. He was the manager. He arranged all of that stuff, and he was no longer there. And Paul definitely has his own workaholic tendencies, and it's just why he's still touring at 81. He didn't want this band to fail, and he felt that there needed to be somebody kind of keeping the machine going. So I can totally see his point of view. at the same time, he's also come back and said multiple times that he always thought of George as a little brother
Hmm.
because they were a year apart, and
Okay.
and George was the youngest in the band, and at the time they met, I want to say George was like 15 or something. I mean, like
Uh-huh.
babies, and he always kind of had that mindset of George being the little brother, and I don't think it dawned on him that he was still treating him that
Right.
way as they were growing older together.
I had heard this grandiose rumors of the animosity starting to build between them. You kind of think when you have four artists like this together in a band, you're all creative and you all can't have your way.
Hmm.
And like you were saying with Paul and John were the oldest, and they were the ones that had kind of started the group, right? I
Well,
mean, with
actually, John and Ringo were the oldest.
okay,
Ringo is the oldest, and then Paul, and then George. It was John in his own band, and then Paul saw them playing and kind of like showed off what he could do and was asked to join, and then Paul got George in, and then Ringo came, quite a bit later. John and Paul were the primary songwriters. They were really the head of everything.
and that dynamic is hard to break, especially when you've got this popular group, and that's just how things have been going. But George, it just as I'm diving into more of the Beatles stuff, was wanting to, start to contribute a little bit more. And then there's a little bit of they're getting older. You want to be seen as almost equals, that everybody's having
Mhm.
an equal say in things. So you are seeing this thing kind of build up within this documentary that people had talked about, and why I think Paul and maybe Ringo and other people that were around this project initially had thought that this was kind of a negative, like they associated negative memories to it, because you could see, and this is kind of attached to what we're talking about, this conversation John and Paul had off camera, but the audio was recorded, where George and Paul get into it, and then George quits the band.
Mhm.
And that's one of those moments to where, like, I am like, oh my, what is going on? It's huge, but it was like done in just such a blink of the eye. I think Paul and George, they were working on a song. The four of them were there, and then Paul had suggested that George do it a different way or a certain way, and George is like, "I'll do it the way you want, or I won't do it.
Mhm.
Just tell me what you want me to do." And so it was kind of George kind of falling back on, "Well, fine, I'll just tell me what you want to do." You can see that how that animosity over the years was finally building up, and why George quit. So that is a moment, along with the John and Paul discussion at the lunch table, that stands out for me. The other one for me is the rooftop performance that I don't think I've ever heard about or knew about, or know that that's the last time that they all performed together.
Yeah.
It's that was crazy to me, but the fact that they were, whoever was in charge of putting all that together, I was like, "Oh my god, talk about somebody that whoever thought about having the cameras and the cops show up and doing all this stuff, that's like made for social media today and setting things up."
Oh my gosh, yeah. And the way that they framed it, like with all the split screens, so you'd see them playing on the roof, and then you'd see the cops down in the lobby talking with Mal Evans and threatening
Oh,
to turn things down, and then interviewing the people on the streets, and yeah, it's such a fascinating little point in history because up until that point you couldn't even hear them play at their concerts because the screaming was so bad. Well, here
yeah.
you can hear everything clear as day, and you're getting in the moment reactions from people who are hearing this music for the very first time. Yeah, it's
Just
fascinating.
absolutely brilliant idea to do it the way they were doing. You had mentioned, I don't know, 30 minutes ago in our podcast here, where they were discussing different places or venues to go to do the concert. And I thought it was interesting how open they all felt in really saying what they either wanted to do or not want to do. So I
Mhm.
don't know who had suggested they go. I forget where to go to initially, and I don't know if it was Ringo or George was like, yeah, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And the same with the rooftop. I think they had talked about the rooftop, and I think it was George that was like, yeah, I don't want to do that. And I think
Mhm.
he was convinced in doing it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, I think this is far more interesting than it would have been if they had been in some fabulous ancient amphitheater or something like that. Like this was just so spontaneous and it was just so them. And getting those reactions of them when the cops come up on the roof and you can tell they're kind of taunting them and it's I think it happened perfectly just the way it did and I don't think anything else would have compared to
And
it.
how does that happen? Like I wouldn't change any of that. How they made how all that worked out. You have to be God that had to been staged with the cops or something, but it wasn't, right. I mean, that was
Mm-mm.
all.
Nope.
It just happened, and they just whoever had the foresight to have the camera station, probably knowing the cops are going to come. Make sure that
Hmm.
you give us some time, that you keep them occupied downstairs to let the boys kind of go through a few of the versions of the songs, and the cops come up, and you can see John, Paul, and Ringo. They're playing, and they're like turning around, looking at the cops, and like I think there was one point to where Paul saw the cops for the first time, and he turned around, and it seemed to energize him. You
Oh,
know,
totally. Yeah. And then at the same time they're doing this, they are recording tracks. Like those takes ended up on the record. Like I
I
don't know anybody else who
this
could
is
pull
why
that
that
off.
documentary was, again, is so brilliant for me, because on top of just the music and the group, and it's the Beatles, but I'm also thinking in the background of having to set up things as a photographer, videographer, podcast guy. I'm like, how did they run all the lines and record this like the right way down in the studio? And they're up on I was like,
Mhm.
I can barely get my podcast studio going right, you know? And they were
Yeah.
able to throw this all up on the roof to where you remember the one point to where I think it was Paul had gone up to check the roof when they were just scoping it out initially, and they start jumping on the roof, and the roof
Uh-huh.
is like doing this. I'm like, there's
Yeah.
no way I would do that.
No. No, it's a miracle they didn't fall through. Uh, yeah, and then it was cold and it was windy and
Couldn't feel their fingertips.
yeah, and everything just went off without a hitch. It came out so perfectly.
And here we are, we have it in like high def, it's all cleaned up, it looks and sounds just fantastic, absolutely amazing. I want to talk a little bit at the end here about another storyline with the Beatles, and it gets attached to the Get Back documentary as well, and the whole breakup of the Beatles. And I had always grown up hearing the story or the rumor, whatever, that the reason why the Beatles broke up, the main reason was because of Yoko Ono,
Mhm.
and always just kind of being around and just kind of inserting herself and just being like, everybody was like, what the hell is she doing here? I knew a little bit of that going into this documentary. When I first saw her, I was like, oh my God, she's going to be a huge part of this documentary. I was surprised, and I'm interested in what you think and what you know about this. I was kind of surprised that she's kind of a non-issue or a non-player. She's there all the time.
Mhm.
Yes. They make a couple comments about her attachment, or John's attachment to her and her attachment to him and her being there. And, she gets in on a couple. I mean, I guess they had to, where she's kind of screwing around on the mic and having some fun or whatever.
Yeah.
But there really wasn't anything in this documentary to where I would I would come out of it and say that she was a major issue. Am I missing something, or what? What's your take
No,
on that?
I wholeheartedly believe that every one of the Beatles' wives and girlfriends, at especially at that time, like the amount of misogyny that was thrown their way was a huge part of the problem. They were easy targets. She was an easy person to blame because she broke up John's marriage and all this stuff. But at the same time, she's an artist in her own right. She's a visual artist and a musician, just like John. And why wouldn't she be interested in what they're doing in the studio? You know, she's like just working on her own stuff. She's not offering suggestions. She's not telling John how to play his parts. She's just hanging out. And Linda's there, and nobody ever talks about Linda being around taking photos and how that was, you know, a distraction. They focus it all on her. Honestly, I really don't think she had much of anything to do with the Beatles breaking up. I think it was the fact that they had lived in such close quarters together for a decade. You need a break from each other. They were starting to splinter off in different directions and be their own people, and it wasn't her. She was just a convenient excuse for that.
I think you're right. And being new to all of this, and maybe there's more data that's out there or more content that, you know, maybe will change my mind. I don't know. I think you're right. It just seems like the issues that they had as a group with each other, there was all of that was kind of already in the works of pushing them apart and breaking them apart. She's obviously the easy target. And I think Paul made a comment or two. One, maybe when they were waiting for George to come back, he made some comment about, oh, the headlines are going to be about Yoko sitting on the speaker or something and breaking up the band. And then yeah. And then he kind of laughed at that. And I think, you know, maybe it was a little annoying for the rest of them. I'm not one of them, that she was around possibly too much or all the time. But for me, just watching the documentary, she seemed to be somewhat, I mean, even though she's like right there, like sitting almost attached to John, I don't think of her as being a distraction. And it didn't look like the others really minded. And like you said, they all had their spouses or girlfriends or whatever coming over. And George had his Hare Krishna fellows come over or something.
I think that would be far more distracting. And I mean, they even like made a little Hard Day's Night reference at the beginning of the film when they saw that guy, and they're like, "Oh, he's very clean, isn't he?" You know.
That's one of George's friends.
Yeah, I think that bugs them way more than Yoko just sitting there. They might not have liked the screaming, but
I was curious what you thought about that, because that was another one to where my preconception of coming into this and watching this, and then when I first saw her, I was like, oh, and I'll admit, I kind of had a negative reaction when I first saw her on the documentary. I was like, it's going to be the Beatles and then Yoko. By the end of it, I was like, she's fine. Unless it was edited out or whatever. I was like, it didn't seem like she was an issue. And I think the respect that John and Paul, Ringo, and George kind of had for each other anyways. And I think they said, look, John needs her to be creative. So that's the way it's got to be. So I think Paul, at least, I think he talked about it the most in the documentary. He was fine with it. I think her being an issue is kind of blown out of proportion, but I'm only basing that off of this particular documentary. So
no, I think you're absolutely right on that. And it's been going on for decades. And honestly, I think this documentary coming out really kind of clears her name in that respect. And
yeah, I would agree with that.
I hope that people are willing to maybe re-examine their preconceived notions about that whole thing.
I think fortunately on that, on the comment there of yours, I think for new people or people like myself or going forward the next 20 years, 50 years, I think that helps Yoko. I think the people that don't like her, it doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I think there's anything that you can give to those people sometimes, regardless of, here's the video, it's right here. Here's the evidence of it or whatever. And they'll be like, I still hate her. She was still the reason or something. I don't think there's anything you can do about that, but I do think it helps her going forward in that. I think you've said before that Paul is your favorite of all the Beatles, right?
Yeah.
Do you have them ranked at all in how you like them, or is there one that you don't like?
No, I love them all. I will always love them all. But Paul is my favorite. Paul's always been my favorite.
So it's Paul, and then the other three are all the same underneath him?
Yeah. I mean, when I'm like ranking my favorite bands, I always put solo Paul and the Beatles together because I could never pick one or the other. I love them. I love everything about the Beatles, and I love so much of Paul's solo stuff too that I don't want to. I could never be like, oh, I just I don't care for Ringo or something, like I could never think that way because that band would not have been what it was without any one of those guys.
I hear you on that. And I know there's a lot of people that I guess that's kind of with any kind of group. Everybody gravitates towards their person in the group, and it's not always necessarily like the lead person for whatever reason. And I'm trying to figure this out. Maybe this will have to come in a part two with you and I, because there's a bunch of other questions. There's a lot of other questions that are popping in my head from things that we've talked about. I was like, we're not going to be able to squeeze it in. I just gravitated towards George for some reason. I like them all coming into watching the documentary, just thinking about the Beatles prior, and again, not knowing much about them. I always thought, well, I guess I like Paul and George, or I'm sorry, Paul and John, but I think they were the bigger of the two within the group.
Yeah.
But for some reason, I feel more attached to George. I like them all, but I feel attached to George. I kind of understand this thing he was kind of working out in, like he was the youngest one coming in, and then he didn't have somebody that he was riding with, so he's kind of the loner as far as trying to get stuff contributed to the group, just always kind of put in his place as little brother. Oh, okay, we'll give you one or two songs, but yeah, go sit in the back and play it the way we want you to play it or something. I found myself kind of just seeing it more through his eyes and his experience, and then as I've extrapolated past the Beatles in consuming more of this content that, like you said, it's almost never ending.
Yeah.
I'm following him through his solo career afterwards. And the last couple of days I've been listening to like Traveling Wilburys, and I'm like, oh my God, I remember some of these songs, but I was like, yeah, this isn't my style. Mm-hmm. I'm ready for it now.
Yep.
And then hearing about his cancer, his passing, and then I guess kind of the paranoid one also about people like killing them or something. And so somebody had broken into his mansion and stabbed him. And I'm like, oh my God.
Mm-hmm. If you haven't seen it yet, Martin Scorsese did a really great George Harrison documentary.
I'm writing that down right now.
Focused on him. It's fabulous. It's also got a soundtrack album that is really great. He's a very complicated guy in a lot of ways. Because he was promoting all this spirituality and peace and love and all that kind of stuff, but at the same time cheating on his wives and doing some things he really shouldn't have been doing. His story is just so fascinating. I mean, as a musician, my God, as a guitar player, I am like, he's influenced everything I've ever done, I can't recommend it enough. You might have mixed feelings about his personal life, but as a musician, yeah, incredible.
That's a whole nother podcast too, about can we separate the musicians and the artists from the things that they do in real life. Amanda, I'm telling you, you were the perfect person to sit down and talk about this. This went by really quick. I know from a 6-hour documentary with so much detail about the Beatles, you can't really just do a 1-hour show on this. But I think we got the gears kind of going talking about this. And I'll be curious, maybe in a few weeks or something, we're going to be like, you know what, why don't we come back for another one and let's hit specific topics within not only Get Back, but shoot, maybe into other areas of the Beatles and Paul and George and John and Ringo. Tell us again, what are you doing now, your personal life, for work, how people can check you out on social media? They're like, well, we got to check out this Amanda. I kind of like her style. What's going on?
So as a musician, I am lead guitarist, backing vocals in a band called Given Names. We are on all the streaming services and we're on YouTube. We're on Bandcamp at Given Names MN because I think there's a couple other bands with that name. So we're working on an album right now. We've got our first single out, so we're working on getting the record finished up. And then I am also a visual artist. I'm a pop artist, so I do painting and mixed media. You can find my artwork at amandawirig.com. I'm getting my website redone at the moment. It will have links to my socials. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm on, you can see my artwork on Instagram. If you go to Facebook, it's Amanda Wirig, Retro Art MN. So you can see my stuff on there.
And I see in the background, Star Wars fan, possibly. Is that a
Yeah,
Star Wars
yeah.
poster?
Yep, that's the original from A New Hope. Yeah.
So we've done a few Star Wars episodes here. I was doing a live podcast show with an ex-host friend of mine. We had a series called Brian and Chelsea Make a Podcast, and it all started from a very first episode to where we were talking Star Wars and we ranked all the movies. And she's a generation. She's well, yeah, I mean, a younger generation that grew up on the prequels, where I'm an
Oh,
original trilogy guy. So that was
yeah.
a great perspective to get as we were kind of going back and forth with the movies and what we liked and don't like. And we had a good time with that. So now I know that I could talk a whole bunch of stuff with you.
I am looking forward to it.
We may have to compare our Star Wars notes, but Amanda, I appreciate you hanging out with me, talking Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary that's out on Disney Plus on the Beatles and the album Let It Be. And well, let me make sure I get that into frame there. So,
Well, thank you
Amanda,
thank you for this. This is so much fun for me. So I really appreciate it.